and hope you're all having a great Earth Week, or you had a great Earth Day. I know I'm so privileged to share this space with you, so I'm going to get this presentation started for you all. Just give me 1 second. Okay, perfect. So yes, today's presentation will be focusing on environmental justice and social justice. And so the way that I kind of designed this is to kind of talk about the importance of why environmental justice is powerful. I think that investing in community-based frameworks, especially that have come from grassroots organizers, is really the true key to liberation and justice for communities of color. So thank you so much again for having me. And I really encourage you all to ask questions in the Q&A box. Like as we go on in this presentation, you may have curiosity to learn more, ask about other things. So feel free to ask. This is a really open space, and thank you so much again for having me. So to kind of get started, let me just move this down. So, okay, perfect. So when people ask me, who are you, right? So my name is Isaias Hernandez. I use he, they pronouns. I'm currently residing on Lenape Greater New York City area. I grew up in Los Angeles, Tongvaland, most specifically in the San Fernando Valley. So I lived in Silmar, San Fernando, and spent my time a lot in Pacoima on the weekends with my godmother. So QueerBrownVegan, right? I think that some people ask me why QueerBrownVegan. And so QueerBrownVegan is primarily an educational platform that is really focused on creating introductory forms of environmentalism. While my work is very centered in environmental justice, veganism, zero waste, I do cover a whole variety of different topics, such as like biocultural conservation, other topics that may interest people to learn about the environment. And so my goal is really to get people interested or invested in environmentalism, especially with the focus in environmental justice. So kind of get to started is, this is me, who I am. I believe I was 7 or 8 at the time. I think first grade, actually. I don't even remember the age, but my power of my pain, right? So as someone who grew up primarily living low income my whole life, I grew up in Section 8 housing here in Los Angeles. And Section 8 housing is basically known as housing subsidies to help you afford housing. I grew up with food stamps. And so at a very young age, I really realized this like economic differences between my cities and other cities I lived in LA, and when I would visit or when I would go on field trips. I grew up recycling cans at a young age, and this was kind of not really seen as anything new, especially with my mom or my siblings, because in reality, in LA, a lot of people participate in the recycling economy. And so I really never saw recycling as this like sustainability thing or being eco-friendly. I just was really taught that it was just based off survival. Like this is what we need to do to survive. And so my parents at a very young age like instilled this like survival mentality mindset, then this like abundance and growth mindset. And I think this is because my parents had actually immigrated from Mexico in the 1980s to California. And so being undocumented, they faced a lot of injustices, especially with the immigration industrial complex. And so for me, it was really personal to understand, although we didn't have that much money, my parents made such an active effort for me to have a really great educational system in the space to really support and having a roof under our head, having food at the table, having access to some type of water. And so for me, it was really an honor to live in this area that had such a really rich cultural diversity. And that really helped me kind of understand at kind of a younger age of like what was going on. And so when I entered education from, first grade to 12th grade, I started to realize a lot of things. One was the fact that, I thrifted because it was a place for affordability for my family, buying t-shirts, buying pants for less than $1 on the weekend for Sunday deals. And so I never really understood why reusing clothes or upcycling them was seen as shameful or seen as a poor thing. For me, I really saw it as a way for people to be able to be clothed if they needed to. And so I lived nearby a few commercial toxic facilities in my city that were not there to employ people or the community, but they were there to pollute and poison people. And so for me, it was very sorry, let me just minimize this and move it over here so people can see. So for me, it was really important that, having access to clean air, water, and soil almost seemed like a rich thing. And when I meant like a rich thing, I really, in my community, I didn't really think about like, what does rich look like? I just thought about like, okay, well, I know my family doesn't really have that much money, but it's also weird that no one in this community has access to clean air or like water or sometimes soil being contaminated due to environmental racism. And so this kind of led me more to become curious. And so a really great story about this is actually in high school, but before that, in middle school, elementary, I went to a beach cleanup. And I remember at a very young age, a teacher told us, we're going to a nice community today for a field trip. And I was confused of what she meant by like nice community. And so we went down, I believe, to Malibu Beach to go learn about ocean conservation. And there was like a beach cleanup with other elementaries participating in it. And I asked the question, why do we have to pick up their trash? Like, why don't they clean up our trash in our cities? And instantly I was removed from not the field trip, but the line. And I was pulled aside by my teacher saying that that was like disrespectful to ask that question and that it should be an honor that I was there. And so that really made me start to ask things at a very young age, to be curious, to be like, why though? Like, I don't see the wrong thing of this. Like, they're making us really partake in this pollution that we did not partake in, and then ask us to like play on the beach for an hour as a reward for picking up trash for like 2 to 3 hours. And so it didn't really feel right to me at a young age. And so this image actually is in high school. So I believe I was like 14, 15. So really trying out different outfits, like, had the emo haircut maybe, had really low self-esteem, like a lot of things were going on in my life at the time. And so during that time though, I remember learning about a lot of important topics regarding climate terminology, such as the carbon cycle, the water cycle, photosynthesis, and like much more other complex diagrams that a lot of us can probably think about, like, well, I don't remember them, and that's okay. And I never really understood what like global warming meant to me until one day in high school, an environmental justice organization came, and it was named Become Beautiful, and they talked about how depending on your race and your economic status or the amount of money you have, that determines your health outcome in your environment. And they pointed about the cities in like Pacoima, San Fernando, and like Silmar being like high level rates of pollution in those areas. And I was thinking about like, well, where does the pollution come from? Like the machines, like the freeway. And so I never realized that all the environments I lived in, especially because I was right next to the Metrolink 2 and a busy intersection, that all cause air pollution. And so I realized too, like they made a point saying like, if you live in Section 8 housing, you're more than likely to live nearby toxic facilities. And this is because obviously we know that having access to housing is unfortunately a luxury and cost, while it should be a human right. But I just did not understand like why that was happening. And so that was really the moment that pivoted me to understand like, okay, I'm not the smartest high school student. I had maybe a 3.67 GPA cumulative. I'm going to apply and I want to do environmental major works. And so I applied to different universities. I applied to all the UCs, only 4 or 5 because they give you free, things about it. And I got into, Santa Cruz. I got into Davis, rejected from Irvine, UCLA, and got into Berkeley. And so I was like, okay, well, I think I'm going to go to Berkeley. And the fun fact actually is that I didn't know where Northern California was because I never traveled growing up. Like my parents would take me to the parks. But honestly, we never really had any vacations. Like maybe it was about going to a fast food restaurant on the weekends to treat yourself or something. So for me, I didn't really know much beyond LA. I was like, well, where's that? Like I've never looked at it. And I was very horrible at geography. So I asked myself this question though before, is that I went to college, like, does having a college degree make you a better environmentalist? And I would say yes if I was 16 and 17 at the time, because what I realized was that why is no one talking about this? I need to change my community and get a degree to change the world. But as I got older and it was in academia and learning a lot of messed up things that were happening in my communities and a lot of elitism that is upheld and a lot of indigenous erasure that happens, I was like, you do not need a degree to be an environmentalist. As long as you fundamentally care about human rights and human well-being, that's more than enough to be an environmentalist. And so this kind of presented me different ways of how I was thinking about my own thought process. And so this is actually a photo of me and my mom, and I had a very unique experience in academia, especially being in environmental science, because I realized then that in activist spaces I was and in academic spaces, they were never really interconnected. It almost seemed like they were differentiated. And I really remember a lot of the hardships I had at university. I was working two to three part-time jobs. I was really struggling to pass a lot of my STEM related courses. I had a very terrible research experience dealing with like microaggressions and homophobic remarks. And so I remember just thinking about like, why is it that I'm doing this major? Like, am I doing it because I love it or because I need to do it to help my family? And so there's different pressures I think I gave to myself. One being the fact that, my family was counting on me to really have a life together to help them economically. But the other half was like, I want to really discover myself as like a queer person when I came out at 17. And so really dealing with this relationship of like LGBT identity, passion for environmentalism, passion to like care about my family almost seemed like it was really hard to make. And so for me, I realized upon graduating, like I can do all of those. It just was going to take some time. And so when people ask me like what really inspires you to be an environmentalist, I think for me, it's about the idea that I was rooted in just seeing social, racial, and environmental injustice. And I say this because at a young age, I think there's this common phrase that people say, oh, that's corrupt, or the government's corrupt. While it is, true, of course, I think it was really important for me to ask, like, why is it corrupt? Like, what exactly are we examining? Like, how do we dissect these issues that are happening in our community? And so I think that thanks to YouTube and thanks to my sibling, of course, for challenging me to really think a lot about the ways that I was thinking and like how to critically analyze things, is that many Black, Indigenous people of color have experienced all of these. And really, in reality, when I think about who's been able to really opt out of these injustices, it really portrays the idea of like how rooted this society is in not allowing people to be exposed or people really actively working to become anti-racist in their own work. And so I became an environmental educator, and most traditionally, no, I did not have a teaching degree, but I did teach courses at Berkeley during my time there. And so, unlike many environmental educators that would probably go to a master's program or get a teaching degree and start teaching at an elementary school, I was like, I want to be a digital environmental educator. And people were like, well, what are you going to do about that? Like, how are you going to make it happen? And so I created QueerBrownVegan not because I want to be something, but because I believe that environmental education is a human right. I believe that people should have access to these resources. And I believe that you do not have to pay thousands of dollars to an institution to learn about these topics. And so as an environmental educator, I really focused and honed in on my creative skills, my passion for design, my passion for color, my passion for who I was as a person, and to really talk about these issues in a very simplistic way. And so I'm really happy to have said that, like, starting my journey back in 2019, when I created the account, I did it because a lot of friends told me, like, the way that you speak, the way that you explain things is really good to help people trying to understand. And so I really realized that all the time I was in academia, I was always silent. I was always listening. And in activist spaces, I was learning and staying quiet because that's what I needed to do. I needed to learn. I needed to understand, like, what is my unique role in this movement. And so Queer Brown Vegan, I'm so thankful for its continued growth and continued success, even to be here today, that I really believe in just creating digital forms for people and that they don't have to feel ashamed for asking questions. And so this has really helped me not only empower myself to learn more, but really empower my community to have these conversations about what are justice-oriented solutions. Why do community-based frameworks actually are essential to the movement in environmental justice? And so that is a little bit about my journey into environmentalism and why I'm so passionate about the work I do today online. With that being said, a lot of us may have not been exposed to the term environmental justice at a young age or really heard of it, and that's okay if you haven't, and that's okay if you have. Environmental justice essentially is a concept that is connected to the social justice movement that looks into the environmental distribution of health by your race, your class, and gender. And so environmental justice in a very simplistic way is saying we want environmental health equity for everyone. It doesn't matter about your class, it doesn't matter about your race, and it doesn't matter about your gender. Us as human beings in this planet have the right to have access to healthy air, water, and soil. And so environmental justice was focused on because so many communities of color, predominantly that were low income, were being poisoned by own environmental pollutants that were in the system, whether that be toxic facilities, whether that be governmental jobs that leaded to the destruction of ecosystems, or whether that be through designed racist policies. And so when we really dissect and unpack a lot of these conversations, the main theme about environmentalism and our ecological crisis is very rooted in the idea of racism and white supremacy and the extraction of natural resources. Is also reflective of how they extract in human beings, especially BIPOC communities. And so a lot of the common statements I get as an environmental educator is the environment can't be racist, like that's not possible. While it is true that nature itself does not discriminate, it is true that the people in power, predominantly who have been in these political decisions that are generally white men, have upheld racist policies, have upheld white supremacy. And so when we look into their development of society, such as like industrialization, focus on massive economic GDP growth, the rhetoric behind it is saying it's great for society, it helped us develop. But in the reality, when you're unpacking that, who are the ones that are the affected? And so in these images right here that I'm showing you all, this is actually an example in Los Angeles where the oil refineries are in people's backyards. And it really makes me so angry sometimes to hear this statement, because if we look to the left, a report that was done, it looks into the amount of toxic facilities in the United States. And you can see they're very congregated, of course, in the East Coast and in the West Coast primarily, and in Texas regions. And that's just the toxic facilities we're talking about. There's much more other industries like the coal industry, petrochemical industry. So this looks primarily at only the waste industry, hazardous waste facilities. And so it's super important that when we're trying to understand more about the environment can't be racist, we need to look into the history and the policies that went into place that affected these communities. Because there's often conversations of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And these conversations are applied in environmental justice. What came first, the facility or the low-income community? More often than not, it doesn't matter who came first. What matters is the fact that, like, why are they still continuing to pollute people in primarily low-income communities of color? And there's been extensive research on this injustice, right? Communities of color have the highest exposure rates to air pollution than their white non-Hispanic counterparts. Landfills, hazardous waste sites, and other industrial facilities are most often located in communities of color. And lead poisoning disproportionately affects children of color. And you see this a lot in urban areas, right? Where people that are forced to live in affordable housing are often met with having to have amounts of pesticides and fumigations done to get rid of the roaches. The paints that are applied to those housings have toxic chemicals. The cleaning products that we use, such as, for example, Fabuloso, has VOCs, which is harmful chemicals, volatile organic compounds that are toxic for your body and your brain development. And so when we're looking at these systems and these like injustices that are happening, you need to think about it long term. So yes, like these people live here. So what? What does that mean? What does that mean for people's educational journey? What does that mean for your parents' health? And so as we know, the medical industry is rooted in a lot of racist practices and the design to profit rather than to serve the community. We can know that most of the low income communities of color are the ones having the highest rates of going to the hospital, have the highest rates of disadvantaged resources in their public educational systems that does not allow them to learn about this. This creates a huge learning gap when so many students and especially parents, working class BIPOC, are trying to advocate for justice and trying to understand these things. And climate change also has such negative effects on low-income communities of color, right? So with the climate crisis here, right, a really famous example I like to use is a lot of that, like wildfires in the West Coast. I grew up in Los Angeles and the wildfires have increased over the past few years. So that means what happens when someone is afraid to enter a disaster relief camp in fear of deportation? What happens to migrant farm workers when there's a wildfire? What happens to queer and trans people when they have to seek refuge in disaster relief zones that are not safe spaces for them? And so when we think about low-income communities being most affected in this issue, we have to think about what's the long-term impacts? Like how long can people last these effects of climate change? And water contamination, right, plagues low-income areas and communities of color across the nation. We've seen injustices happening here in California. We've seen what happened to Flint, Michigan. We've seen what happens to Detroit. We've seen what's happened in other areas in different states, and they're continuously telling us that the water levels that we're drinking is fine. Water contamination is the largest issue that has affected children of color in rural areas, especially indigenous communities, with nuclear colonialism and migrant farm workers who have been poisoned by the amount of pesticides. And so this contaminated water can cause such a variety of health related issues that, again, we need to look back of like who has access to medical resources, who has access to mental health resources, who has access to take their child to have much more learning opportunities. And so these are kind of cumulative in our own learning system. And so we get into this concept of like, well, environmental racism, right? Like, oh, the environment can't be racist. And so environmental racism is attached to the environmental justice movement that specifically is examining the policies and practices that disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous people of color. And so this often kind of easiest way to think about it is that communities that have to live near landfills, sewage plants, other toxic facilities, and it looks into the economic inequalities that have been created by a lot of urban areas. And so a really great example of environmental racism today that's happening is immigration camps. What's happening in detention centers? They're being built below toxic landfill sites. Children are being exposed to toxic pollutants. And the administration, as we know, is complicit in supporting the immigration industrial complex. And so when we think about just communities, we also have to think beyond our city. Prison industrial complex. Many of the inmates, that people who have been imprisoned, actually, that are released from jail have a 30 to 40% health decline in their bodies due to the extreme amounts of labor, due to the extreme amounts of toxic landfills that they're underneath. And this is a huge issue of like, why is this happening to people? And so we go into the history of the environmental movement to kind of think, well, when did the environmental movement start, right? And a disclaimer to add is like, yes, Black, Indigenous people of color, especially Black, Indigenous communities have always been advocating against environmental injustices, especially with the civil rights movement in the 1960s that looked into the displacement of Black farmers that were losing their land due to white supremacists and that were displaced by racist policies and being sprayed to toxic pesticides in their lands. And so to look into environmental racism, I think it's super important that we look first in the US of what happened during the 1960s and 70s. So during the 1960s and 70s of the environmental movement, it was heavily dominated by white middle class, that their political base and their political careers were focused on just environmental reform or regulatory relief that looked into preserving ecosystems. And the issue that with conservation is the fact that they were advocating for the protection of animal species while actively ignoring that indigenous communities were the ones that have always protected these ecosystems. And since there was a lack of representation in the environmental movement, it often overlooked marginalized low-income communities that were near dumping grounds of a variety of environmental hazards. So that looked into, the media highlighting what they wanted to hear, right? Save the planet, save the turtles, let's recycle. Plastic is a huge issue. And so there was a failure of intersection by the media to really portray this, to get people to start to think critically about this. And the issue with the environmental media, especially news stations and newspapers, is that it basically portrayed environmentalism that white middle class people were the only ones that cared about it. And when you hear these statements, especially with friends saying like, oh, hiking is a white thing, environmentalism is a white thing, why is it a white thing when Black, Indigenous people of color have always have deep embedded relationships with the land? And due to the history of colonialism and displacement and imperialism, that has really erased a lot of our culture and has attempted to erase a lot of our culture, that a lot of the times modern media portrays this as only white individuals caring about the planet. And so on the right image where you see Get Involved Now, Pollution Hurts All of Us, this ad was creatively done by Keep America Beautiful that talked about the issue of plastic pollution and portrayed someone that was indigenous to talk about how they're hurting the ecosystem. And as humans, we need to be better people to our planet, not to pollute, not to litter trash. While this was a very creative ad, it sparked conversation, it also failed to address that, one, this person is not even indigenous, he's Italian, he was a hired actor. Two, that corporations are not responsible, but people are. And so what does that do? That continues to feed into the narrative that working class Black, Indigenous people of color, all they do is they're lazy, they contribute to waste, they don't care about the planet. And so we grow up with this distortion of idea saying, oh, well, our parents don't care about the environment, or they don't really care, our community doesn't care, when in reality, they do care. But a lot of injustices, such as the social economic systems that have not allowed them to have a better quality of life, they don't have the time to invest in this. And that's not to say that they're not doing their job, because they're teaching us, they're teaching their other communities, maybe they're inspiring other people. We all have different unique roles. And so the environmental media today still has the issue by centering a lot of white climate activists and white environmental activists. And so in order to really make this movement much more intersectional, is that we need to recognize of how decentering is essential to environmental justice, and how recognizing that grassroots activists were the ones who advocated for this change. They're the ones who paved the change. They didn't go to higher education and they don't need to. And so I think that it's super important that when we realize like our community doesn't care, that we rephrase it and say, our community does care. They're doing work differently, and I see it, or I hear them out, and I will find them. And so the birth of the environmental justice movement is a very unique movement. So as we talked about the 1960s and 70s, people not really caring about the environment, quote unquote, people of color not caring. This movement, the injustice movement, was centered on Black Indigenous voices. And so 1980s, 1990s, it looked into reports that race and class determine in your community that you live nearby a toxic facility. A famous environmental activist known as Hazel M. Johnson, which is the mother environmental justice movement, she resided in Southside Chicago, where landfills and sewage plants surrounded her home. Following her husband's death from lung cancer and seeing the rise of respiratory issues with her community, she began documenting cases around her community and started to ask, like, I know that the water and air quality is not safe here. I know I live by a toxic facility, but what can I do? So she created community-based participatory research, where basically you have communities volunteering to collect data, to ask a set of questionnaires. They have their own ways to design this research. And so she demanded that the Chicago Housing Authority should be held accountable for their failure in managing the building and ignoring environmental health issues. And so through her advocacy, through her community-based framework, she led a successful campaign, and she sued the housing authority, and she won. And she, after that, years later, she created an organization that is environmental justice focused and still is alive today, called People for Community Recovery in 1982. And she continued to fight against environmental racism in Southside Chicago. And this is Hazel M. Johnson. So on the left side, she's, I don't even know who the politician is, but was invited to the White House for her work, and she actually closely worked with the Environmental Protection Agency. And this is an image on the right of her. Although there's not really that many images of Hazel M. Johnson that you can find online, I would recommend definitely checking her out. And so the father of the environmental justice movement is very interesting. So Professor Robert Buehler wrote that whether by conscious design or institutional neglect, communities of color in urban ghettos or in rural poverty pockets or economically impoverished indigenous reservations face the worst environmental devastation in the nation. And so he actually Professor Robert Buehler documented a lot of research, the civil rights movement that sounded the alarm about these issues with communities, families, and farmers. And so basically the environmental justice movement kind of started to mobilize more. And very interesting thing about Dr. Robert Buehler is that he's written a lot of extensive research that basically proves that the institutional policies that were implemented were racist, and they have always upheld to racist structures. And so it's very interesting to see the fact that it wasn't by accident that they made these communities live nearby these communities of color, these toxic facilities. It was literally because they knew they wanted to continue growing economically, and the most feasible option is to place them in low-income communities of color. And so Dr. Robert Buehler says that, there is no level playing field. Like, communities of color do not have the same level. It says anytime our society says that a powerful chemical company has the same right as a low-income family that's living next door, that playing field is not level and it's not fair. And so Dr. Robert Buehler is actually still alive today. He's very popular on Twitter. You should check him out. But he basically is saying the fact that there really is no justice for these communities that have to go against these powerful companies, because either the government backs them, B, they have massive amounts of funding to sue the community or to sue the environmental lawyers going against them, or C, play a lot of dirty tactics, whether that be stalking, whether that be harassing, sending private PIs, private investigators to crack down on grassroots organizers. So it's a very dangerous way to kind of challenge it. And so Dr. Robert Buehler says, well, what do we do when a legal institution is upholding these racist policies? We need to fight against them. And so anti-environmentalism begins because anti-environmentalism is a very interesting thing that was starting to happen back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, primarily in the 50s and 60s, basically saying, this propaganda saying like, stop the eco people, stop the green people, it's hurting our jobs, like they're not letting us mine. It really showed messages to these people that worked at coal mines, working in the train transportation industry that used to work trains, saying like they're trying to take your jobs. Society, not that it became developed, but had more technological resources available at the time. And so basically it was this idea of like implementing, saying to people that were in the working class that worked in these fields, saying they're trying to take your job, let's not do that. And so anti-environmentalism is a movement that's composed of two groups. One is corporations that have agendas to really promote right-wing policies or to continue allowing them to extract natural resources. And then conservative organizations that also may include people that may be in rural towns or in other cities that don't understand the idea around climate change. And so these people argue basically with scientists, people and activists that they're overreacting about the climate crisis. And so what's really interesting is that anti-environmentalists are sometimes victims of disinformation and misinformation that have been technologically maybe left behind and economically left behind as society began to have more different jobs in different sectors. And so during the 1960s and 1970s, there was this rise because corporations started to put their money into politicians more often. Not to say it wasn't the case back then, but now is much more public. And so you'll see that why a lot of environmental activists ask, well, who is backing you? Like, why are you backed by an oil refinery? Like, why did you accept donations from a fossil fuel industry? Like, what are you promising? So corporations were invested in using thousands of dollars to give these politicians to be like, if you help me, I'll give you this much money for your campaign, as long as you don't vote for greener energy, as long as you do not vote against our deregulation practices. And so corporations in unison decide to cooperate in an unprecedented way, building coalitions, alliances, putting aside competitive rivalries, and working together saying, hey, we're both extracting natural resources, but the Greens are coming for after us, and we're going to work together to continue to fight against it. And so they have millions of dollars. And so this is kind of the issue that we're kind of facing, especially with politics, right? Money buys people. And so there's definitely a lot of articles that have promoted cases of an anti-environmentalist doing this and corporations doing this, one being BP and Shell and other corporations. And so are, a lot of statements saying, green energy, like the wind turbines are such an eyesore, right? This ad actually came, I think, 2 years ago during Trump's presidency, where he said that, birds are dying because of, wind turbines. Meanwhile, it's like, you're not looking at the coal industry that is killing communities of color, polluting ecosystems. And so it was almost weird to see this like dichotomy of differences that were being presented in this image. And so we enter this like kind of new realm of like anti-environmentalistic climate realists that is seen today. And it's so very interesting. So climate realists are basically people that collectively agree that yes, the global mean temperatures have increased like at least maybe like 1 degree since the prehistoric times. But what they're saying is that the climate crisis is very complex and that we can't call it the crisis because there's a lot of unknown factors that affect the environment. One of the most interesting examples that I've actually read about climate realists is that their argument saying that the solar dust or the air dust or space dust affects the climate due to the solar rays. And so there's a lot of very physics and like chemistry behind the way that they're trying to say that, well, we can't determine it's a crisis because we haven't looked at X, Y, Z. And so yes, there's that 1 degree Celsius since 1850, but there's other arguments that say like, oh, well, you need to look into the solar output, the Earth-Sun geometry, the interstellar dust that I was mentioning that is not heavily studied. And so The reason why climate realist is a big issue today is because it fuels a lot of people within QAnon. It fuels people that are in climate change deniers. And so these people are a little bit the same as you would say as anti-environmentalists and corporations, because these people actually have millions of dollars and are funded by a well-known institution that we're going to be covering. And so the Heartland Institute harbors a lot of these climate realists that discover, develop, and promote free market solutions to social and economic problems. And it's very unique how they talk about free market solutions, and they have ran ads saying that tobacco is good for you. And like, it's been a lot of very misinformation that has been put out there by this institution. And so it's a conservative and libertarian public policy think tank, and it was founded back in 1984 in Illinois. And this institute conducts works issues on reforming quote unquote education based off like government spending, taxation, healthcare, global warming, hydraulic fracturing, socialism. There's just free market environmentalism. And so they do a lot of things. They don't just do environmentalism. And so this is an example in the 1990s where they worked with a tobacco company to discredit the health risks of secondhand smoke, saying that it wasn't real, it's not that bad. And so since the 2000s, the Heartland Institute has been leading a promoter of climate change denial. It rejects the scientific consensus on climate change and says that policies to fight it would be damaging to the economy. So this institution that is for capitalism, for the development of quote unquote society, is pushing for GDP growth, which is we know is unsustainable as an over-consumerist society, is basically trying to discredit a lot of people. And I'm going to tell you all, guess what type of people are in this? Climate realists aren't just politicians. A lot of them are professors at top universities, actually, that have extensive degrees in environmentalism, economics, engineering, astrophysics. And so these people are not just the people that you don't think, oh, well, they don't know anything about the environment. These people have extensive academic science backgrounds. And so when we ask ourselves, who are climate realists? We can see a very common trend of the people that have been promoting climate, denouncing climate alarmism. A lot of these are white men. There are a few white women that I did not show the whole list of course, but primarily these people that have either economic power, are embedded in politicians, have extensive amount of academic experience at top-notch universities, are still operating today. And so it's very dangerous when we as climate activists or environmentalists of color are trying to fight against injustice by institutions that are known to uphold it. And that's not just it. We're going to actually unpack someone who has been hired by the Heartland Institute that is someone that is your age probably. She's now 20 years old, I believe, or 21. So the anti-Greta, right? I think that some of us may have read this article. And so the media has portrayed Naomi Sabit, I believe, she's from Germany, as the anti-Greta. She denounces climate alarmism, saying that it's not real and that we shouldn't focus on it. And so many variety of right-wing parties and organizations have been invested in her work. And she's been hired by the Heartland Institute to help further push that message. And so it's very interesting how they pit Greta against her, because Greta obviously leans more left wing, in different ways. And so the issue with climate realism is that, yes, it's primarily old white men, but it's also younger folks that are being involved in this work. And so this is kind of the issues that we're seeing today, that yes, we have always lived in a polarized society, but it's even becoming even more interesting to see how youth are engaging with this. And so people ask, well, why does this matter? Like, why do you care about showing this about to us? And so because BIPOC and environmental organizers have been discredited, harmed, silenced, or even sued for speaking against injustices. And environmentalism itself is political. There are prominent people in the environmental movements have been trying to speak about these injustices for so long, and ignoring and avoiding these topics about race, class, and gender because they make you feel uncomfortable further inflicts violence not on only like on me with my community, but your peers too. And so fighting for a healthy environment means that you need to have these conversations. And so we go into this framework of climate justice. And climate justice was actually created by an environmental justice organization in the Bronx, New York. And so this actually framed it in a cohesive way, saying like, we cannot frame climate change or climate crisis as an environmental issue, but it's a political and ethical issue. So it basically saying like it all intersects. How does colonialism, how does imperialism, how does white supremacy that has disrupted ecological system, indigenous peoples, and cultural diversity, how do those intersect? And so climate justice recognizes that different groups of people are differently affected by the climate crisis, which we've seen before in, examples like Louisiana when Hurricane Katrina happened, when we've seen in Northern California when Paradise and upper Sacramento areas were hit by the wildfires that were decimated. And so what climate justice is saying is that because of these effects of climate change, it also exacerbates inequitable social conditions, which means that it's harder for the individual to live there. It's harder for someone who's undocumented or economically suppressed to afford to afford their medical bills. Like, what are they doing? So what's going to happen to these people? Like, are they going to die and be left behind? And so momentum in building climate justice solutions are not just focused on our focus, yes, primarily on saving the planet, but are primarily saving planet for the planet and people, which means that when we're talking about and dismantling industrial systems or extractive systems, that there's a just system and a just recovery for people who are living in those environments. That we just don't say, oh yes, we got rid of the toxic facility, but what about the communities of color? They still don't have reparations. They still don't have justice. They still don't have access to healthcare. What are we going to do to create a just future for us? And so climate justice, is primarily focused on the flower on the left side, clean air, like what do you reimagine clean air, no fossil fuels, like unions, women-led, fair labor. And so climate justice has been very popular in advocating for that systemic change, because for so long, I think sometimes in environmental movements that focus on individual lifestyles don't really extend themselves to that local change and then extending themselves to systemic change. That I think climate justice has really portrayed a really great framework in understanding these intersections and why it matters. And so there's this phrase called frontline communities that so many people talk about, and you're like, what is frontline? Like, yeah, maybe there's a frontline. And so to kind of dissect this is that frontline communities are mainly composed of Black, Indigenous people of color whose respective neighborhoods often lack infrastructure to support the current climate change, such as, what happened in Louisiana with the dams, or what happened with Paradise, the wildfires in Northern California, lack of forest management due to cultural burning being banned by white conservationists and Indigenous communities. And so frontline communities are not just Black, Indigenous people of color. They're people who are queer and trans, people who are in prison, people who are immunocompromised, people who are elderly, people with mental health chronic conditions, people that have been victims of these extractive systems. And so it's not just people who are people of color, but to be specific and to humanize this experience is that there's different people's lifestyles, people's identities, people's abilities, people's working levels, conditions, career levels. And so this is why it's so important to recognize, like, when we're using frontline community, that we're being very specific in the way that we're addressing these issues and the importance to emphasize that we're humanizing this experience, we're humanizing storytelling, we're giving that a chance to understand people, to understand, like, if you don't understand racism, like, you'll have to understand storytelling. And then we go into intersectional environmentalism, right? So intersectional environmentalism, that was, first off, to give credit to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined intersectionality to describe the experiences that Black women were dealing through an institutional lens. And so Leah Thomas, that coined intersectional environmentalists, described it as not only to acknowledge these links, but to bring them at the forefront of environmental activism without minimizing or silencing overt discrete forms of oppression. So in simpler context, kind of advocating for the people on the planet. And so Leah did this because she saw the lack of environmental conversations centering primarily Black Indigenous voices. And so for her, she really wanted to make that difference, to advocate for change. And so back in, I don't believe April, around this time, or March, with the rise of injustices, especially with George Floyd, she did a graphic about Black environment, like Black environment, but I believe Black intersectional environments for Black Lives Matter, or I believe it was under that. And so that kind of created this shift of like people trying to understand, like, okay, what does it mean to be an intersectional environmentalist? And so I've had the privilege to know all the co-founders at Intersectional Environmentalists. I actually work with the team today as a consultant. I'm their educational development coordinator. And Intersectional Environmentalists is a really great organization that has been focusing on the intersections between people on the planet and discovering different topics, whether it be fashion, outdoors, the history of Earth Day, women's rights. There's so many resources out there that Intersectional Environmentalists offers. That's really become a hub of a community of like-minded environmentalists to kind of seek refuge, or really to seek action of what they can do. And so climate activism, right? Like, are you a climate activist? Like, I don't call myself a climate activist anymore, but I think that it looks different for every individual, right? We all have unique roles in this movement, whether you're a grassroots organizer, an educator, a photographer, model, writer, poet, singer, dancer, journalist, cook. We need different forms of activism. And so you get to define your activism, whether that be in person or digital. There are different types of privileges in activism that it's important to note, right? Such as the amount of environmental land defenders who are murdered every year in Central America, in Latin America, excuse me. And so recognizing, like, yes, we all have different privileges of who's getting centered, who's being decentered. And so it's super also important that we don't gatekeep this information, that we don't acknowledge like, oh, you do digital activism, like that's not real activism. And so we all have different abilities and talents in our own skill sets that one should not have to shame themselves for not knowing about this. And so I get this question a lot, really interesting, is that why do climate activists burn out, right? Like, why is that people who do environmental work burn out? And I think that's because there's a lack of physical mental health resources, right? That really go into supporting people doing this work. Number two, right? Constant news online about, ecological collapse is harmful, because I think in a capitalistic society that we live in today, it doesn't allow us to reimagine a society without it. It says that without capitalism, we will all suffer and die. And so I think this is the idea that we push back, is that we need to reimagine. Reimagining is beautiful. And so number three is the lack of representation and diversity being shown in the environmental movement. Primarily women of color and non-binary folks and trans folks not being centered in many conversations, either being left out, and also the role of colorism that does play in the centering of who gets to get centered as an activist. And so being compared to other climate youth activists and constant thinking of comparing yourself with other activists also contributes to that burnout. I've talked to many youth activists right now that are in college, like you all, telling me the same thing of comparing themselves with all these like well-known activists and telling themselves that they're not good enough. And there's also this lack of accountability for climate activists who have harmed others in the environmental movement. In both social and racial justice movements, there has been harm, there has been harassment, and should be accountability. The cancel culture is different from accountability because accountability is asking people to acknowledge the harm that they've committed and to look within themselves and to admit that harm and to unlearn. And so, also, the other reason why people burn out is the amount of hate and death threat messages. The amount of environmental justice activists that I have been talking to via phone that do not go on social media due to being tracked is the constant hate and death threat messages they receive online as a person. I myself too have received death threats, actually, received one 2 weeks ago. And it's not fun to get these messages. It's really not. It makes you reevaluate your work and say, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this anymore. And not having time to enjoy to hang out with your family, friends, or loved ones. I realized like I had the privilege as a college student. Like, yes, I was always stressed, but I got to live my life as a college student. I got to go out to parties. I got to go out to events. I got to go out to see friends. And so many times climate activists dedicate themselves to only environmentalism that you're eventually going to burn out. It's almost as if it's asking every day from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., you have to go to class. Eventually that person is going to burn out. Eventually that person is not going to have the same passion to do that same thing because they don't get to rest. And so a lot of climate youth organizations that I personally know, people of like Zero Hour, Jamie Morgolin, Re-Earth Initiative, Shia Bastida, One Up Action, Kevin Patel, Earth Rising Up International, Alexandria, Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Future, all of these amazing organizations that have been fighting for environmental justice as a community. I really recommend you all to check it out, seeing how you may want to be involved. I know Sunrise has a Bay Area chapter, Zero Hour has a Bay Area chapter. And so there's different ways that we can all get involved. And so there's this idea that I worked with my friend about is how do you be an active ally? What is sustainable activism, right? And so my friend and I kind of dissected this and said ways in which you find practices in your work that are everlasting, regenerative, and equitable, meaning that you're implementing systems that you can confidently engage in for years, not just weeks, right? As we saw with the recent injustices last year with George Floyd, the black squares that were being posted on Instagram, that's not allyship. That's obviously performative activism. Like, what happened to those people? What happened to your friends that posted it? I have friends that did that. Like, that's the last thing that I saw them post. And so sustainable activism is just like new ways that to really relook the ways of your relationship with the work you're doing, whether you're in social justice spaces, whether you're in racial justice spaces, academic spaces, that you know that when to give yourself that time to make a boundary with others, ways to understand that you're donating your time or your economic wealth into communities of color. And so I really believe as a content creator myself that although I am getting paid for the work I do, I really do believe in the idea of redistribution of wealth and opportunities, because I would not be here today speaking at this event without the help of other people that have helped me in my community. And so I think that with sustainable activism, it pushes for people to protect grassroots organizers, support mutual aid funds, and 3, protect your community locally. I think that a lot of the times we shame ourselves saying like we can't do a system change, but start off locally because local journalism has declined. And so we're being exposed to all these global news in different states that don't pertain to us, that it often disrupts this image of like, oh, it's not real. And so it's super important that we practice sustainable activism in our work because this is what's going to help you fight against injustice your whole lifetime. And so I guess I tell this kind of ending a little bit is that you need to love yourself sustainably because like creating a circular relationship with the earth community itself helps you foster that passion and make a world a better place, right? You're unlearning these perfectionist values that you need to be this to do an activist. You need to know this much information to be able to speak about this. Work on building cultivation than expecting to blossom in your work, right? Cultivation shows that resiliency, empowerment, and growth, right? I think that when I look into my younger self, I think that I wasn't really loving myself sustainably. And yes, it's easier said than done when people say love yourself, because there's days where I hated myself. There's days where I was annoyed, I was frustrated, I was confused, but I still did love myself. It just wasn't the same. So when you create that relationship of like, yes, you're going to be a better steward to the planet and the soil, you also acknowledge that, yes, like when the earth hurts, you're hurt. And so it's really about creating much more interconnected relationships with how you see the world, rather than saying, this is a me, myself, and I. And I had this very individualistic mindset in college where I used to say, oh, I hate people. Oh, I hate people. But in reality, I don't hate people. I hate the systems that poisoned and harmed people. And yes, there's a lot to unpack too with toxic masculinity, like like there's a lot to unpack there too. And so I think that we need to shift ourselves, not to be more loving and like kind people, but being more loving to yourself in a sustainable way rather than a one-off action. And so that is something that has really helped me as really as an environmental educator, but also as a person to evolve from, I'm 24 now, from like how I was when I was 21, thinking I was an adult, thinking I knew everything. And so I leave this statement saying, we cannot liberate our planetary crisis without our community, because it's super essential that although our community is not perfect, although our city has a lot of issues to work on, it's not to say that future generations and our older generations, they didn't contribute to this. And so we have this duty to ourselves to serve our community, not to go back to be a savior, but to join along those spaces and to listen, to help in your own unique way, like record, redistribute food, different ways that we all play. And I think that that's one of the biggest things of why I like community-based frameworks and why environmental justice means so much to me, because it's rooted in the idea that communities are going to seek justice, not institutions. Institutions only create change because the community has gone to those spaces. Community creates more change than institutions, in my view. And so when I talk about environmental justice and like racism, it comes from these years of pain, degraded health issues that I have to live with every day that I was never properly ever diagnosed for. And so there was this frustration that the fact that I still makes me angry because so many younger kids that live in my area have to go through that. Yes, I went to a university. Yes, I don't live in that community anymore. But what about the people that are still there? And so this is why environmental justice is super important, that we don't forget our roots, that we don't forget that injustices are still affecting our loved ones, and that we need to mobilize together as a community to fight against these extractive institutions and systems that have allowed this. And so my question to you all is, what is your role in the environmental movement? Because I think that I'm here today to learn from you all about what is the unique talent that you bring, rather than me telling you about what it is. Because at the end of the day, I've always believed in circular learning. And so this is more of a classroom that we get to sit in a discussion rather than me saying, this is what you need to do. And thank you so much for coming to this presentation. I think Fighting for Our Planet Community itself looks different for everyone. You can connect with me on any social media handle at QueerBrownVegan, or email, or LinkedIn, and my website, QueerBrownVegan.com, if you want to find out more information about my work. But this has been such a really great presentation to be in and to really learn more. And I guess this has been such a great presentation. This is going to be an open Q&A. So I'm really excited that we're going to learn and more and explore more. So I'll hand it over to Nancy.
Hi. Oh my gosh, that was a really great presentation. I know we rehearsed it before, but yeah, it was really, really, really great. Everyone, if you can join me giving your Zoom round of applause. And yeah, the rest of the time will be an open forum for some Q&As about anything you covered, or whatever else is on your mind. And then I'm pretty sure everyone has the ability to unmute themselves if someone can test it out for me?
Testing.
Perfect, great. Then you'll want to start by raising their hand, and we can call on you, and then we'll go that way. Okay, Jonathan.
Yes, so first, that was great. A lot of things that are constantly in my mind. Like, I love how you pointed out that, the ad, the Keep America Beautiful ad, I just did a presentation about just that, how extended producer responsibility should be adapted in legislation, primarily. So I love that you pointed that out. It's crazy to me, the term climate realist is so dangerous, because at first it caught me and I'm like, okay, this is pertaining like facts, and it's not. And so I feel that it's so crazy. I watched a movie called, it's about corporations just, being sketchy. And one of the things as they mention is the Heritage Institute and Harlan Institute. And it's just crazy that, yeah, a lot of scientists are in there too. I love that you pointed that out. So I have a question mainly because I like how you pointed out that we feel so burnt out. And I feel that a lot of that is shared with people of lower resources, of scarce resources. I'm from Guatemala, and my family in Guatemala are always like trying to cut corners and reuse things, and unconsciously kind of being sustainable in a way. And so my question is, I feel that, for example, I eat whatever, right? But I eat mostly vegetarian, like throughout my week. So I can't say the same for my family in Guatemala, because they just eat whatever's available, and whatever's affordable. And for example, how things are marketed, I feel like I sometimes feel like I hate people too, but it's like you said, it's the systems, because we have funneled people of scarce resources to eat a certain way, aspire to certain goals that are not sustainable, and things like that, right? And so what do you think about the frontier of cultured meats as some of the solutions to industrial agriculture pressure? You think that's something that's sustainable and viable?
Yeah, so this is actually a really great question. And like, yeah, I love that. I think that the most sustainable food systems is locality and by bioregion. And so even as a vegan myself, like I have pointed this out, is that like, yes, like what I eat is not ethical. Like I partake in a global food system, and like it's not normal to see like, dragon fruit every week at the produce store I go to. Like that is not in this bioregion. And so because we live in such a global food system, it has economically suppressed so many other farmers, and like the concept of food sovereignty, right? Where they're trying to dismantle a lot of these neoliberal policies that prevented them from selling food locally or defining their own food systems. So I think that the idea of cultured meat kind of is a parallel to like plant-based meats, because plant-based meats are focused in another form for me as like green capitalism. Not to say that they're horrible. I think it's a really great solution for people to hopefully go plant-based, but they're never really the key to dismantle industrial ag systems. And this is because industrialized systems have been always focused on GDP growth. And so regardless of these new innovative ideas that still need investment, it's still not related to regeneration. And so I think for me, when I try to think about technological solutions, I really try to tell people like looking into regenerative ideas that are stemmed from indigenous communities. And there's this really word that I actually learned recently of the idea of rematriation. And rematriation is basically from indigenous communities that describes of like weaving in seeds into back to the land. And so it's recognizing that the most sustainable or the most way to liberate ourselves from these systems is to dismantle them. That's how I see it. But speaking in the sense of like a legal framework, it's so complex because the amount of political and economic power that the industrial ag and like Monsanto and the the punishment of migrant farm workers that have to work at slaughterhouses and farms. It's such a huge issue that I think it's hard to get localized food systems. And so, yes, fighting for food justice is super important. But I think, yes, like the lab culture of meat is a very interesting thing to see. But I don't think that would remove industrialized meat, because I grew up eating meat my whole like 21 years of my life, and my mom would go to the local, I don't know, Food for Less or like Vallarta in like Los Angeles and get meat. And so it's things like that where I would hope to see there's more education with plant-based foods. But yeah, that's a little bit about my thoughts.
That's great. Thanks. I mean, I was gonna answer your question too. I feel like my role, I really like when I'm hanging out with my friends, they always point out like when I'm washing dishes, oh wow, you really barely use any water. So I feel like kind of educating people about resources is what I want to end up doing. Water and agriculture is one of those things. Like vertical farming is one thing that I feel like I could get involved in. And so, yeah, that's a great answer. I feel that it's definitely, you know, any climate problem is going to be a multifaceted type of solution thing. So we really have to weigh in as many options as we can. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think that, you know, I think in college I was like always ready to be right, but I think we need to be more ready to be wrong or challenged from different global perspectives, because I do acknowledge a lot of my upbringing is based off Western experience, which means that a lot of the terms I learned and like a lot of the techniques I've been learning is rooted in different global perspectives. And so I think in trying to tackle this solution, that we don't blame ourselves, that we are not doing enough. There's a really great Instagram page called A Growing Culture that I think you should definitely look into. They talk a lot about the ideas of like food systems, land sovereignty, food sovereignty, and just realizing why a lot of regenerative agriculture is part of that solution, and why we need to dismantle industrialize meat facilities, and also thinking about just transitions where who's not going to get left behind, because most of the times we want to dismantle or like eradicate the system, but what about the people who've been reliant on that system that exacerbates this cycle of injustice? So it's things like that where as a community, that's where we have unique roles to kind of address and like support people.
Is that a hand, Marilyn, or is it just applause?
It's an applause, but I also have something to say. If that's okay, if someone else has their hand up, I can wait.
You're good. Go on.
Okay, so amazing presentation, and it really, I really felt it when you were talking about like your background and your family and all that, because I'm also like Mexicana, you know, like, you know, my grandparents, they came over here, they immigrated over here. My parents, you know, we're going through an immigration status right now, and you know, it's hard to sometimes, with the struggle that we've gone through, like we see like all these things like, oh, you know, thrifting and all this and that. And, you know, growing up, I went to Sacred Heart, you know, we couldn't pay our bills sometimes. And, you know, we didn't have food. And we used to go to like these mutual aid groups or charities. And it was always like frowned upon, or like kind of like we would get faces and things like that when we would reach out for assistance. And it's like now, you know, it's people are doing it as like a fad, going to Goodwill or Savers, and like in a way it's just like, this is not a fad, these are people that actually need help, you know, taking pictures while they're doing you know, giving to the homeless and things like that. Like some of these people, like, you know, they want to respect their own privacy, and like they're embarrassed also of what they're going through, and sometimes it's hard, you know, because I remember going through a situation where we couldn't pay the rent, and we actually lived in our car for a short period of time. So, I mean, the struggle of like sustainability, we lived within our homes, and to see it marketed is sometimes kind of like, wow, okay, well, there's some people who really just don't understand. And in a sense, growing up, like I saw this documentary on Netflix regarding minimalism, and I was also going through some mental health uh, breakdown, and I also didn't have insurance, so there was no way. At that time, I didn't really know of the free resources that there was, so I was in a bit of a rut. And once I saw that Netflix documentary, I was like, huh, well, I mean, I already am living a minimalist lifestyle, and these two white dudes are just like doing it out of like, and it's just kind of like a lot of people, I think, who have a background of like, and through our heads, through our minds, it's a struggle, but is marketed differently, whether it's social media or on TV or radio, podcasts, whatsoever. And so I really, really appreciate you bringing forward, how like, I guess different platforms and different people who are privileged to talk about this, right? And kind of bring it about the situation is kind of like, well, we need more people of color in this field to talk about it, because I feel like we can bring a lot to the table and kind of like diminish some of these terms that in reality they've been around and nobody really knew about them until like, a certain demographic is now out and about talking about it. And it's like, this has been a problem for many years. So I really appreciate that conversation you brought up.
Yeah, I send you a consensual e-hug. I completely understand like the first point, like with thrifting, like I don't see it now as a negative thing. Like we have a huge landfill of clothes, like there's such an issue. And so yes, people reuse, yes, buy. The second thing is like the fact of I think about younger generations not having to get teased at. Like luckily I did not die. I just sometimes got called like, you have poor people clothes. Growing up, it didn't really ruin me, didn't like make me feel bad. But like this dress shirt actually I have, like I got it in like sophomore year of high school. And I don't know, like 16 at the time. I'm 24 now. And people were like, where did you get it? I'm like, I thrifted it years ago and it still lasts. And so, yeah, so I think it's such a struggle, because I think like with sustainability and zero waste, as mentioned from the other thing, is that other speaker, is that it's really rooted in the Black Indigenous people of color, and like a lot of Indigenous communities that have really these deep embedded relationships with the earth, that never use plastic, that never use these things in our cultures, to in different ethnicities or cultural based experiences or personal experiences, have always done this. And so I do think there's a responsibility for those that were centered in the lifestyle movement, that are generally have large platforms, to kind of acknowledge that. And also people that say, I care about the planet, but never mention anything about race, like Black Lives Matter. Like it goes to show to me, like you only care about the planet maybe in your area and like the animals, but you don't care about communities of color. You can give less of what they think about or what they're trying to do. And so I think that for me, like, I don't like, for me, like, yes, being an ally is an active thing. But for me, I think that in my work, trying to understand solidarity, in helping, not even helping, in trying to fight against white supremacy that is designed, the system that has hurt and harmed and murdered Black individuals, like I need to recognize like my own privileges and like how I'm fighting for Black Indigenous liberation. And so I think for me, like maybe I won't achieve that solidarity, but in my lifetime, at least I have something to do, and I don't care about the title, I need to do something. And so I think for many of us, like we just have unique roles in that understanding. And yeah, I think the struggle is real for a lot of people. And like, I look back at it and like, I remember just feeling so embarrassed to ask my parents for like $10 to go out to the movies, or like, I felt so embarrassed to ask for $20 to go get pizza with friends. Like I always said, no, I can't go out. Or, you know, like having to take the metro because they defunded the school bus in my area. So then I had to take 2 buses and then get harassed by weird men. And I didn't know how to like respond. And so those are some of the real implications that I think that like we need to invest in our community. Mutual aid is what has been helping people. This is really what we need, and this is what we have. And so thank you so much for sharing your story. And like, again, I'm sending you a virtual e-hug because I really appreciate you. It takes a lot to share your narrative, and like, it's re-traumatizing sometimes. So thank you.
Does anyone want to go next? While we wait on that, my mom got this for me at a yard sale. Her and my dad will always show up when I come visit, and they're like, "Mija, te agarramos esto." And I'm like, yeah, they still dress me 23 years later.
You know what? That's funny because you say that, because my mom actually and my dad sometimes go thrifting still. And they're like, "Look what I got you." And I'm like, "I'm not going to wear that." Or I'm like, "No, like," and so sometimes they picked up good clothes. And I'm like, wow, like my dad actually was cleaning his closet when I was in LA a year ago. And he had a lot of clothes from the 90s. And I was like, "Wait, you used to wear this? You didn't tell me?" He's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "I'm taking some." So it's things like that where like reusing and like your own parents instilling a lot of lived experiences, like it's so funny. And yeah, someone said, "Oh my God, closet steal." Yeah, it's honestly real. And I did that with my brother too, and my sister. My brother actually is the same height as me. And so my brother actually started to get invested in trying to dress nice, because he's like, "How do you style yourself? Or how do you find a style?" And so I was giving him tips of like, "Oh, you should dress this, or like try this." Like we have the same body shape, like we're same height. So I was like, "Try this out," or like other things. And so I'm glad that like a lot of people are just getting invested in just like reusing clothes, and like also trading with your friends. Like I remember my friends like, "I love your jacket. Can I buy it off of you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'll give it to you for like $10." And like, I don't need it anymore. I rarely use it. And so normalize buying clothes off your friends too. It's not weird. Like you just bought it off of them and they don't need it anymore, and it reduces waste.
Oh my God. Yeah, I love that. So when we're in person, the ERC does a clothing swap, and it's so interesting. Like someone's like, "I would have never bought in this, but I get the chance to try it for free. Like this is gonna add some spice to my style." And yeah, totally. My sister's here, and I'm 5'3", she's 5'2", and we're have super identical body shapes. And she's like, "Here, wear this, wear this, wear this." So it was really great. We got to do all that all the time. And my brothers, they're super tall. So my dad could never share clothes with them. He's like large. My brothers are like almost 6 foot. They're like, "Yeah, it's nice to dream," but that's really cool. I love hand-me-downs. And yeah, Doc Martens from the 90s. That looks super cool. Like I wish my parents would have kept more of their things growing up, but it's hard to preserve sometimes.
I know. I love. Sorry, I love Doc Martens. Actually, how whoever said that, but yeah, I got these like 3 years ago, but they last so long. Honestly, Doc Martens. I'm surprised by the like of like that. This has survived me like the ice, the wind, like the concrete. Like I don't know. Those shoes are designed really well, but yeah. But if anyone has any questions regarding career or anything, like feel free to ask or even write your question, because there's really open space. And like I'm 24, so like I'm not like a professor or anything. I'm just like a person.
I have a question regarding, what do you think about GIS? Is that something that's useful going into looking for jobs after graduating? Say my degree is going to be environmental studies with natural resources management specialization. So I'm thinking about taking ArcGIS, which is like a free version during the summer. But I don't know if that's useful anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, GIS is actually very useful. I actually have a friend that did geography at UC Berkeley because I went there. She majored in geography, and she actually got a job at Apple for doing GIS because their demand in for GIS. A lot of companies are in it. So I learned it in a wildlife conservation class for like one chapter, and I hated it because I didn't know how to use it. So, and also I was rushed. It was like it was kind of like the instructor was like, either you get it or you don't get it, or you're not smart enough or you're not. And so I was like, oh, I don't get it. Like, this is not a semester. And so I had a bad experience with it. I got through the assignment and I was like, I'm never touching ArcGIS again. It looks really hard, but I know a lot of people really love it. And yes, it is actually in demand in a lot of environmental fields. So GIS is super like a good skill to learn. And I really wish I could have taken a class on it, but I was also scared to take it because I was like, I don't want to fail, or I'm not that smart in GIS. So yeah.
Plus it's very expensive, like the program for it to get like
Yeah.
a certification.
The computer labs generally have it because it's just an expensive program and like it requires a lot of bandwidth too. So yeah, I remember doing it in a computer lab for like monitoring like species in like different environments, and it takes a lot of work.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, here in Houston, I just want to get your thoughts on this. So here in Houston, something that I've noticed is that historically minority communities, like on every corner, they have like liquor stores and fast food restaurants, and they don't really have access to healthy food or farmers markets or things like that. And I was just wondering, like, if you consider this an environmental justice issue and your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so what you called basically is food swamps, and food swamps are areas where basically there are liquor stores, fast food chains. And so the idea of grocery redlining is the fact that some grocery stores were actually bought off by bigger chain grocery stores. And so a lot of these grocery stores that are bigger have a lot of racist biases against communities of color, thinking, oh, they're going to steal, it's not a good profit margin. And so generally, actually, groceries are built in a lot of urban areas that they know that they can actually get a lot of, they were actually built in suburbs first, but now they're moving into urban communities because of gentrification being an issue. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of grocery stores that either shut down by the larger stores or not reopen is because the fact of like, oh, they're not that profitable, or oh, we don't want any other food co-ops coming here, so we own the land in this area, even though they're not in operation, which is really messed up. And so that's why a lot of communities of color have taken the time to change their own lawns into food gardens. And this is like the idea, the fact of like, planting a grocery store like would help communities, but like it's not going to end food insecurity. And B, we have such a food waste issue where apparently it's illegal. Like I've gone food dumpster diving in New York. Actually, I did it last year with a few people, but even then it's a little bit dangerous because as people of color, like you're probably going to be like, you're stealing, whereas a white person may partake in it. It's not, there's a lot of discrimination too that happens. And so I think that, I think it's really a sad thing. And I think in trying to advocate for more, I would say supporting local food co-ops and also supporting food justice organizers that have been doing this. Like I know in LA, they have the food fridges. This is organization, it's a plant-based collective. It's called Veggie Mijas. Definitely everyone check out Veggie Mijas. They do a lot of events where they like connect people with like plant-based food. They're POC ran, women of color, non-binary folks centered. And so it's really a great organization. But yeah, food swamps is an issue, and that's a form of environmental racism. Someone said, I'm going for nursing. Do you think there's anything that healthcare can do in this movement? I think that health, like that's such a really important role. I think understanding that medical racism is real in that industry. So I actually follow a lot of BIPOC doctors. And so there's actually an activist, her name's Michaela. She talks about the idea, like she's actually trying to be a doctor herself and like is in training and everything in the UK. She talks about like how people are taught in nursing school, or not nursing school, and like how to treat patients, that typically the images that are used of how to tell someone has a fever or how to tell someone's like an infection uses a lot of white hands, like, pale hands. And so it's easier for nurse practitioners to be like, okay, like, I know what you have. But when a person who may be brown or black in different skin tone, they don't know how to examine them, or they're like, oh, it's nothing wrong with you. And so it's super important, I think, that like when you're entering these spaces, that you're implementing anti-racist things of like, how do we know like how to tell the difference of skin tones of like when a patient is feeling something, because the way that people react based off their skin color is way different. And so I think that's why we've seen a lot of issues. And also the idea of racist doctors and racist nurses, that's real. That the way that they treat patients is horrific. And so I think that in recognizing when you see injustice in your own nursing industry, or if you see someone being racist or someone being biased towards a person of color, definitely address them or call it in or invest in anti-racism. Like, hey, these are people we're treating. We don't get to pick and choose who we want to treat, because if that was the case, then you need to leave. Being a nurse practitioner or a doctor means that you care about people's lives. That's the focus. And so I think that's one tip that I do recommend in reading about medical racism. Oh, Marilyn, I think you had a question.
Yeah, so regarding that about nursing, I actually worked at Kaiser as a medical assistant, and I can honestly say I've seen some people who have had a power trip, doctors, some nurses, some higher ups there. And I'm just gonna say, if you're gonna go in there, I mean, there's union, right? But at the same time, even some union officers will try to like, they're not as fair. So I'm gonna say, like, as long as you are within a community, and this is any place you decide to work, you have your philosophical belief, right, system, and what you think is right ethically. So you as a person, I'm pretty sure there's going to be others who think the same. You can unionize your own and like stand up for what is right, because I can tell you right now, there has been, like I said, there's people who have power trips, and sometimes you got to be like, even if you have like the degree or whatever, you're nothing out there, you're nothing. And so, and it's the same thing for me, like, it doesn't matter, you don't come at people like that. So just letting you know, like, as long as you're within community and you're working with like just the utmost ethical and your own philosophical like principles, that's going to bring you wonders, and that's going to make such a grand difference.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that, Marilyn. And yes, and I also love the person who linked the article. Jonathan linked the article about medical waste, because that's super important that you can advocate for change. I know that no one should ever feel ashamed for using plastic if it's for your medical needs. That is super important, and it's used in this industry because of sanitation reasons, health reasons. And so this is not to ever shame anyone who may need it. People with disabilities use plastic, and it's super important for them. And so I think it's, yes, like, I think advocating in different ways. So like maybe like implementing plant-based meals for patients. I know Kaiser had a vegan burger when I was there in Oakland. So I was like, wow, they have vegan food now. So that's really great to hear. But if anyone has any more questions, let us know. It's actually been really impactful and really great to hear from everyone's stories.
Go ahead, Ijoma.
Hi, my name is Ijoma. I actually have a question, or more like an open conversation. So this morning on Twitter, I actually saw someone tweet about being fast fashion is the only thing like so that some people can afford, and maybe shopping from Shein is like what they can afford, and they see people shaming them for shopping from Shein. Well, in my opinion, I think in a way this is true, but I still also think that there are other factors, like the companies are the ones that are supposed to be getting like these mentions and like people telling them to be more sustainable and not actually the consumers. Of course, we can do our own part, but like 90% it should be like from the companies. You're talking about like the hospital thing, and I know, like, you know, sometimes like, yeah, we can only afford to buy fast fashion, or we really want this thing that's like from a fast fashion company, or, you know, like our medicines, they come in plastic. So I just want to know what your opinion, or even anyone's opinion, is on basically just trying your best in the way that you can and not feeling like people are shaming you.
Yeah, I love this. It's actually a really great person I included. Her name's Aja Barber, that talks about sustainable fashion. And she actually makes a really good argument saying, if anything, fast fashion is more expensive. And actually, I relate to her experience, because for me, going into Forever 21 H&M in high school, like $20 for a t-shirt was a lot of money for me. And so I was used to going thrifting because it was like only $1. Like the highest my dad and mom would be like, if I wanted a piece of clothing, they'd be like $8, that's too much. Or $10, they'd be like, hell no. And so I think that there's like different ethics of like people's. At the same time, yes, I don't like, you know, when I went into college, I was like, I want to try fast fashion. Like, I didn't think about fast fashion, but I was like, I want to try the malls now. And I bought some clothing, and in reality, a lot of that clothing like broke down so easily. It's cheap. And some of it's fashionable. I would say like it's not as fashionable as the clothes I bought back then, because it's based off trends. But I think that in fast fashion, it's super important that like, if you do have the economics to invest in thrifting, like definitely do it. At the same time, I think like the idea about sustainable fashion, Aja Barber talks a lot about this, is that you're paying for the ethics, because like clothes has been economically suppressed as a global society here in the West. And so we're used to being like, oh my God, like, yeah, like, of course, $20 for a pants is like a good deal. Like, why would anyone want to pay $100? Well, it's not to shame you either, but it's to think, okay, well, workers need to get paid. How do you make clothes that is responsible for the planet? How do you make sure that people are being paid for the labor that are actually weaving it in a correct way, rather than being in a factory? And so I think that's one of the really important things that we should kind of consider. But at the same time, yes, I don't think people should be shamed for buying fast fashion, because we've all done it, you know, at some point in our lives. And if you do have the economics to save money and go thrifting, like, why not? At the same time, yes, I do think the fast fashion industry, like H&M, Forever 21, they're focused on like maximum economic growth. And they blame a lot of consumers, but in reality, they don't even pay their garment workers. And so at the end of the day, when we think about supply chains, like, yes, we as consumers have a lot of power, but like, who's the one that gets the most screwed over? Is it someone that's getting shamed online, or someone who's not even getting paid that day or facing harassment? And so it's not to like make that person feel bad either, but to kind of think about like our own privileges too. It's like, oh damn, like I know someone else doesn't even have a voice to share this. And so yeah, I think talking about these issues is super important.
Thank you. I agree.
And also, I love the comment you said about poor economy, because yes, low income individuals, like, they've been economically suppressed. So it's like, at the same time, like, yes, it's not the fault on the low income individual person. Like, they're just trying to live, you know, like, that's not their fault. And so, yes, I think there's a lot of nuances that like need to be like discussed, which I really love. And yeah, I think if we had a more just economy that's focused on redistribution of wealth, instead of, you know, these fast fashion companies that have billions of dollars and they don't want to redistribute that wealth, like, can you imagine how much clothes would change? So yeah.
Yeah, totally. Oh, sorry, you can go.
No, go.
No, you can
go. I was just gonna kind of build upon that with like, it's really frustrating too with like, we all know fast fashion is bad, and then you jump on Instagram and you see celebrities being like, oh, I have a new collection with Fashion Nova, and it's like, first of all, you have so much money that you can afford to not buy these clothings, and I know that you know it's bad, and it's just like BS that they feed that to us. And so I think it's really important for people to realize what's going on and realize that they're literally just making money off of selling you bad, cheap clothing. And like, I love Megan Thee Stallion, but she's been really good about like, oh, I'm trying to eat more vegan food. And she even did like a beach cleanup, but then she like has a line with Fashion Nova. And I'm like, make it make sense. You know, it's kind of just frustrating when you see these people who have so much money, like influencers are doing it all the time and all these celebrities. And it's like, why do you guys fight for one thing and, you know, stand up for all these environmental issues or even like social justice issues, but then you are profiting off of, you know, like you were saying, these people are making money making these clothes. They're barely making a couple dimes. And it's just, it's very frustrating, and I don't give into it, but like it is hard too, because you want to keep up with the trends and you want to look cute and dress nice, and you're being fed this all the time. And I think it's just important to remember, A, these clothes are going to fall apart. B, it's not that important. It's going to go out of style. Like my clothes that I probably wear the most are like the most basic stuff I've had for years, you know?
Yes.
So yeah, sorry, I kind of went off.
No, I love that. And I think you pointed out good things, is like what was said before from the previous speaker, like, you know, someone buying fast fashion compared to a celebrity, right? Like the impact is huge, right? Like, why are we focusing our time on someone who keeps buying fast fashion as a consumer? Well, we have celebrities teaming up with like all these fast fashion companies. Like, yes, we glorify these celebrities, but they should not be excused from some of their partnerships. Like, how much money do you really need from Fashion Nova? Like Macy Williams that launched H&M like 2 weeks ago. People were like, why would she do that? Like, she has so much wealth. She's so famous. People love her work. But they were just so disappointed by the fact that these fast fashion companies prey on these celebrities and lie to them too. Maybe it's a disinformation of like, hey, you want to help the planet and make money? And they're like, yes, of course. And so they ride on to that. And maybe their team needs to be addressed of like, why do you continue actively supporting these extractive systems? Like, if there's one thing you can easily do is divest from that partnership. And so I think that in the realm of like consumers, like I think a lot of us as individuals put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect while glorifying these celebrities that have so much capital wealth that they can really redistribute in different ways. And so, yeah, I think those are the conversations that need to really be held, rather than us trying to shame each other, being like, why did you go fast fashion? You know, like for me, it's like, oh, well, my friends, like I go to H&M. I'm like, okay, cool. Like I used to go there, but I don't anymore. But if you do, like, I don't, it's fine. Like not fine, but like kind of like I will encourage you to go like thrifting, checking out things. But if you can't, like, it's not the end of the world. You're not a horrible person. We've all contributed to this system in different ways. And so it's all about it looking into our impact.
Responding to Lindsay's question. Oh, Wendy, you can go next. Did anyone else see Paris Hilton yesterday? Like promoting ThreadUp? And I was like, wait a minute.
Oh my God.
I was like,
she
what?
did?
Yeah. Oh, did you have something to comment, Ijoma?
Yeah, I was just gonna be like, oh my God, like that was insane. In a way, that was great, but also in a way, it felt very performative to me. But then, you know, Paris Hilton, she's such a huge person and influencer. So in that way, it's great to like tell her followers to, you know, thrift more and etc. But then it just felt very unoriginal to me as well.
Yeah, that's the issue too with companies. They're not investing in creators that have been doing this work together. And yes, it goes back to the publicity. Who will get us the most views? Who will get us the most followers? Who will listen to who? And they're like celebrities. And so one thing I think I've seen on TikTok is people saying like, unfollow celebrities, unfollow them because all they do is promote fast fashion brands. And so that is one thing that has been advocated. But I did want to give space to Wendy because I know that you have your hand raised.
Hi, I just wanted to add on, I think what was Lindsay said. I feel like a lot of the reason why a lot of kids shop at H&M and Forever 21 is because they're not really knowledgeable in what fast fashion is. And I'm in my 30s and I had no idea, you know, that it was that bad to shop at those kind of locations. I had no idea that, you know, celebrities were getting so much money for promoting like Fashion Nova and things like that. So I feel like, you know, the people that do follow those kind of celebrities are younger, and I don't feel like they're educated in fast fashion, because I know I wasn't. And my parents also always shopped in the thrift store. So when we got like one thing from Forever 21, it was like a huge deal. So, you know, it'd be great to, you know, spread more knowledge about, you know, how Forever 21 gets their products and things like that. Because that's something that I had no idea about. Yes, education is key, what Nancy said.
Yeah, I love that, Wendy. And I think you brought up a lot of good points of like, it was almost seen as celebratory. And I think as younger generations, especially like I was, you know, I'm 24. So like in middle school, high school, like Hollister, Aeropostale was so popularized. Like everyone was getting it. And if you didn't get it, like it was like, oh, you're not that cool. And so, yeah, there needs to be this like disruption of like these ideas of like what we think about fashion and like styling. And so, yes, a lot of younger audiences may be misconstrued in the information, and like it sucks, but I'm really looking forward to especially younger generations, especially because I have a lot of high schools and colleges that are like, I'm into sustainable fashion. I'm like, I wish I could have done it like when I was earlier, because I didn't even know in early college. In early college, I went to H&M and like Forever 21. And so I think too, also people are investing in more good quality clothing and the investing of sustainability, right? A lot of people remember when I shopped at Forever 21, and my sister did too. She was saying that in like 2010, the quality of Forever 21 seemed great. A lot of people say now the quality of Forever 21 clothing is really horrible. That's what I've been hearing now. And I actually visited Forever 21, I think 2 years ago with my friend because she wanted something. And I was like, the clothing just looks so, like, it looks cheap. It looks horrible. Like, I don't remember it looking this way. And so, yeah, there is this like question of like, how much are these fast fashion brands are producing at the fast rate? Like, how much do they want this clothes to get out so they can just continue making money? And when like the pandemic hit, right, like a lot of like Remake Our World and like other Fashion Revolution pointed out like how these brands like locked the funds from garment workers, and like they didn't want to redistribute them, and like people had to pressure them online. And that was done through a community. That wasn't done through celebrities calling them out. And so that's the action about social media.
Does anyone else have another question or comment or anything? But thank you, Wendy, for bringing that up. I know you brought up in your presentation that like these people, they're just not educated. So it's like almost like you feel bad that they're climate deniers because they just didn't have access to these resources and this knowledge.
Yeah, well, I work with a lot of high school students and a lot of middle school students who do still wear a lot of Forever 21, a lot of, you know, Hollister, you know, a lot of, and I don't feel like it's their fault. I really do feel like they're not educated in this stuff. And I wish they were. And if more celebrities educated on this kind of stuff versus promoting, you know, Fashion Nova, I feel like a lot of students that I even teach now would wear secondhand clothing and things like that.
Yeah, and I think too, as I've gotten older, I guess like for me, my collection has decreased of clothing I have because one, the pandemic, but two, like I just was like thinking, like I think we need to rethink the idea of like how much clothes do you really need? And I think people shame each other for reusing clothes. Like, oh, I saw you wear that on Wednesday. Why are you wearing that same shirt? And it's like, why not? Like is that, are you giving me money, or are you dressing me? Like you're not. And so I think that we need to disrupt the idea. And that's why I feel like we need people like you, Wendy, and like Lindsay and Ijana, like asking these questions about like why do people think this way? Like, how do we educate people? Like, we need people in the fashion space. We need people in the eco-friendly living space. Like, we need that, because as an educator, like, I don't cover that as much. Like, I do acknowledge it because I know about it, but we need people to constantly talk about these things to kind of create that ripple effect of change. Well, if anyone has any other questions regarding any topic, please let me know. But this has been such a really great space to like conversate with everyone. And I really love the direction of fast fashion. I honestly like want to learn more about it, and like have been learning from a lot of people that I follow, like Slow Factory, as mentioned, and like really knowing a lot about their work. And yeah, I feel like this has been such a fruitful conversation. And yeah, I can't wait to see where we all go.
I'm gonna plug Ijoma real quick because she spoke at our first event talking about, we did a whole thing called Sustainable Fashion 101, and she talked a lot about the industry, the problems, some solutions. So Ijoma, put your @ in the chat because she's awesome. She's a really good resource. And then I'm gonna stop the recording here.
Oh.